In this video, I'm going to teach you 30 positional ideas in the King's Indian defense. First, let's properly define what King's Indian defense is. So if I were to go back to this position, the King's Indian defense would be this system right here. We go g6 and d6, we put the knight on f6, bishop on g7, and white has pawns on d4, c4, and e4. So anything that is not this, so for example, if we were to start out with e4, and then if we were to play something like this, for example, without the pawn being on c4, this is not the King's Indian defense, this is the Pierce defense or the modern. So you have to remember that King's Indian defense is specifically against these three pawns. This is the King's Indian. Now after knight to f3, which is one of the main lines, we of course castle with the black pieces, and let's say bishop to e2, this is the main line. Now the main idea of the King's Indian, and the way we're going to start out this video, is by talking about the ideas and the main systems that exist from here for the black pieces. So if you take a look at this position, we're not really challenging this center of white right away, and that's because we're trying to get our setup with the black pieces. But at some point in chess, you always have to challenge the center, and the way we do it in King's Indian is by these two pawn breaks. So either e5 or we can go for c5. And there are some other systems as well, like for example, in some variations you can play knight c6, a6, b5. That is a possibility, not exactly here though. So you have two main systems, e5 and c5, and then you have some deviations within these systems. So for example, here white can play d5, white can capture on e5, white can also just keep the tension and wait for you to take on d4 and get this type of a position. So all of these are slightly different structures that can happen in the King's Indian defense, and same with c5. So if you want to be a strong King's Indian defense player, you need to be aware of every system, and you need to figure out which systems work best against which variations. And of course we're going to talk about all of this later on in the video, but for now remember that the main systems that you are going to go for in the King's Indian defense are e5 and c5. These are the two main ways you are challenging the center of the board. So let's start by discussing e5, d5 systems, and idea number 2 is going to be to put the knight on the c5 square. And let's say we play a5 in this position first. The goal of a5 is to control b4. We're going to talk more about this later. Let's say opponent castles. Now we want to go knight a6, and we want to go to c5 from this route right here. We can go to d7 as well, but a6 is slightly better because from d7 you're blocking in the bishop, but even more importantly, you're blocking the knight. Sometimes this knight actually goes back to d7 here to go over to c5 or to control c5. So this route of going to a6 is just a little bit better in some scenarios. So in this case, let's say bishop to g5 is played. You're going to put the knight on c5. This pressures the pawn on e4 forever. And if you're able to maintain the control of b4, you have already equalized with black, and you're actually in some positions you're even going to be much better with black. We're going to talk about b4 right now. One of the most important concepts that you have to remember is the battle over the b4 square. So in a lot of these positions, if you can control b4, you're going to be better with the black pieces. So for example, after a5, let's say white castles here, and you go knight to a6. The reason why we fight over the b4 square is because the main idea of this position for white is to get a c5 pawn break in. For us, it's f5. We're going to talk about this idea very, very soon as well. But if we're able to control b4, we're going to be able to control c5. a5. So it's very important that we have our pawn on a5 controlling this square, and when we put our knight on c5 we are still maintaining some control. And white actually has to be very careful. If white tries to go for a3 b4 very lazily, we can play this move a4 in this position. And look at this, when we play a4 we basically shut down b4 forever, because if white plays b4, now we have en passant and we maintain our knight on this very nice c5 square. So the only way a4 would be bad is if, for example, the pawn is technically hanging, so it has to be defended. But in a lot of these positions, say we play b6, not exactly the best move right now. In this case, playing a4 might not be the best, because there's bishop takes c5 and there's knight takes a4. So we lose a pawn. So there's a very concrete reason why a4 is bad. But in a lot of these cases, if I go back to the position that we had earlier with bishop to g5, when that wasn't the case and we can play a4 freely, this basically just shuts down this move b4 completely because of en passant, and our knight stays on this c5 square forever. So if we're able to achieve something like this, we have already equalized with the black pieces bare minimum. So this is a very strong idea, and the way white would be able to challenge this idea would be with actually an idea of his own. Say after knight to c5, knight to d2 is played, defending this pawn. Let's say bishop to d7, just simply developing just a random move just to showcase the idea that we want to play. Bishop d7 is actually one of the best moves in this position, reinforcing this a4 move. But now the way white actually challenges b4 is not with a3, because as we talked about, there is still a4. The way he challenges it is with b3, and then you play a random move. Let's say queen to e8, or you can even go h6. It doesn't matter so much, but let's say queen to e8. Then white goes a3, and let's say h6, bishop will retreat, king to h7. Then white will go b4. So white is not trying to play a3 b4, white is trying to play b3 a3 b4. So even though this might look a little slower, and it is a little slower, this ensures that white is able to get this pawn over to b4, because with a3 you cannot do so. There will be a4 and you will get blockaded. But with b3 first, then you can play a3, and then you can play b4, and this is how white fights back, and this is what the battle on b4 is all about. There are a couple of details that we have to discuss in this position right here, and the thing is that white is not obligated to play this move d5. If white does play d5 willingly, then you can go for your a5, knight a6, knight c5 ideas, the thing that we just talked about earlier. But white is not obligated to go d5 in this position. White can castle instead. And now the thing is, if you want to play these structures with d5, you have to play knight c6. But the downside of knight c6 is that yes, it forces out d5 and it goes into this structure right here. You're also not getting the ideal knight placement, because you're putting the knight on c6 and then this knight goes to e7, so you're not getting your ideal knight placement on c5. So this is just a slight move order nuance that you have to know with the black pieces. But then this knight is going to be useful later on. It's going to be supporting f5. It can go to g6 later on once you start pushing your pawns, so it's not end of the world. But the main idea that you have to remember is to go for f5 in these positions. It's all about the rule of the pawn chain. You want to play in the direction that your pawn chain is looking towards. So for black, that would be this pawn break f5, and for white, that would be this pawn break c5, because white's main pawn chain goes this way, and he wants to execute b4 and c5, and he wants to open up this side of the board to start his counterplay over there. Now this can look like something like b4 immediately. This is called the bayonet attack, and then knight to d7, c5, f5, and both sides are basically attacking each other. Black is trying to attack on the king side, white is trying to attack on the queen side. Now, in a lot of these positions, you have space disadvantage with the black pieces, and that is why King's Indian defense at the highest level is not necessarily considered the best opening choice. But the thing is, at club level, it is very effective. So remember that this is a fantastic opening that you can play at the amateur level. And the thing in these positions is that whenever you go for f5, you have to do it only after d5 has been played. The thing is, you cannot go for f5 if d5 hasn't been played and if the pawn is still on d4. For example, if you try something like knight to d7 and then try f5, this is simply not going to work because the center has not been defined yet. White does not have to close down the center with d5 anymore. White can now open up the center completely. Then he can attack your queen. Then he can attack this pawn for, oh, that's not even the best move. Actually, knight d5 is better. He can attack this pawn on c7 right here. And the thing is, it becomes very, very difficult to defend. Say you defend this pawn with knight to a6. There's this move pawn to c5, opening up this attack on the knight, trying to remove the defender of the c7 pawn. Say you play a move like, I don't know, c6, for example. It's already completely lost. This loses very easily to knight e7 check, king to h8. C takes d6. So this is completely winning for the white pieces. Going back, you cannot play f5. I cannot preface this enough. You cannot play f5 if d5 hasn't been played. For you to be able to play f5, the center has to be closed. White has to play d5, and then you can move this knight away, and then you can execute this main pawn break f5. Oftentimes, when white wants to execute this c5 pawn break, white will play this maneuver of knight to e1 and then knight to d3. This is a very useful maneuver because it gets out of the f file, which means that if f5 is played, you can play f3 with the white pieces, and you have the option to do so because you moved the knight away and you can reinforce your center just like this. And also the knight on d3 supports the c5 pawn break. So this knight is very, very useful on this d3 square. Next up, I will give you a way of taking advantage of this bishop when it is on e3. So if white hasn't played a move like h3 or white hasn't played knight to d2 just yet, you can play this move knight to g4. And with knight g4, what you are attempting to do is to win a tempo. Now, let's say this bishop goes back to d2. This is not a good move. There's only one good move in this position, and that's to go bishop to g5. You don't want to allow black to trade a knight for bishop because this is white's good bishop. So you have to move the bishop with white, and you cannot just retreat because the thing is, this way black successfully wins a tempo because when you went knight to g4 with the black pieces, you did it with a tempo on the bishop. So now you get to play f5. Now, if you went back to d7, let's say, you cannot play f5 with a tempo, so white can continue with his plan of a3 and b4. But with knight to g4, now you have won a tempo and you're one move ahead. So after captures, you can capture with a pawn and you get your pawn break in very quickly. But in this case, white's best option is to go to g5, counterattacking the black queen instead of retreating the bishop. And in this case, you want to play f6 with the black pieces. And let's say this bishop goes back and you can play h5. You can actually play g5 as well. You have multiple options and multiple ways to continue here. Let's say you play h5 and then knight to e1 to attack this knight or to kick it out with f3 at some point, not immediately because there's knight to e3, of course. Let's say you go b6, h3, you retreat the knight, white goes f3 to bring this bishop back at some point, but you will continue with f5. So the game continues on from here, but this is already slightly better for the black pieces, and you still have your main plans of f5, f4, and then g5, g4, so an attack on the king side. We're going to talk more about that very, very soon. But the thing is, with knight to g4 and then with f6 and h5, you have one time. Even this h5 move, it's very useful because later on you're going to be going f5 anyways. Right now you can't because the queen would be hanging, but later on you're going to play f5, and this h5 move is going to be very, very useful. So remember to go knight to g4 in order to try to win a tempo and try to get this bishop out of here. Let's say we get our pawn to f4, white continues with a3 to try to play b4, we go g5, rook to b1, and a5, or h5, sorry. So white is trying to attack this way, black is trying to attack this way right here. So this is an idea that we have already seen before, b4, a4, a4, we go g4, c5, knight to f6. So both sides sort of maneuvering their pieces to the right squares. So what do we do in a position like this? How do we continue our attack when we know that white is attacking us over here? In these situations, we have a very nice rook lift, rook to f7. And this has a couple of ideas. It has three ideas in mind, actually. So this rook f7 move is a very, very multi-purpose move. Firstly, it defends this seventh ring, so it defends the c7 square right here. So after potential captures, knight c7 is not a possibility because the rook covers that square very well. Secondly, it frees up the f8 square, so the bishop can go to f8 to guard this pawn on d6, which is also under quite a bit of pressure. It's defended currently, but you can overprotect it with bishop to f8 so you don't run into any issues. And thirdly, when you play bishop to f8, your rook will be able to go to g7 to attack this king on g1. So this is a very, very cool idea. Let's say bishop to b2 by white. We will go bishop to f8, rook to c1, trying to go knight to c7 anyways, rook to g7, and our attack on the king side continues. Sometimes with the white pieces, when you're getting attacked on the king side and you know that your counterplay is not going to be as fast on the queen side, what you can do is you can actually play this very, very clever move, pawn to g4. And this looks absolutely ludicrous because we're not supposed to be pushing our pawns in front of the king. However, with pawn to g4, notice how we are sort of locking these pawns over here and we're not necessarily allowing them to advance. So if h5 is played, we will go h3, and h4 is of course really bad because it completely locks down the position. And if hg4, we can go hg4, and this also sort of locks the position here. We can go king g2 and fight back on the h file. So this would be totally fine for the white pieces, or even rook f2, rook h2, same idea for the white side. So the thing is, this g4 is a very nice defensive maneuver, and the thing is, if en passant is played, then we will simply capture back with our h pawn, and this might look a little bit weak, but the thing is, at least with the f pawn out of the way, our bishop is open on this diagonal right here. We even have access to the e3 square, which we don't have access to e3 right now. But after g4 and en passant, now we can put our bishop on e3 once again. And as I said earlier, we can go king to g2 to protect everybody. And this is just a fine position for the white pieces. Actually, the only move to keep equality for black is bishop to h3. Every other move is worse. If you play a move like, I don't know, let's say h6 to guard this pawn, there's king to g2 protecting everybody. You're gonna go bishop e3, you're gonna go rook h1, and actually you're going to be fighting back on this side of the board in some variations, of course. So remember to go g4 whenever you realize that you're being attacked. This is a fantastic defensive resource for white. So let's say we have this position right here. How do we continue our attack? The thing about this position is that it looks very natural to play g takes f3, but that is very wrong because after g takes f3, white is actually going to counter us on the g file. So playing a move like g takes f3 is not useful for the black pieces in most cases. If the king was on g1 and if in this position it was black to move, then you would capture on f3 and you would create a massive attack on g2. But after king to h1, this is a very important defensive resource. This doesn't quite work anymore because, as I said, white will go rook g1 to counter us. So in these types of situations, we can go with pawn to g3 instead, and this is the way we fight this king right here. This is the way we try to checkmate this king. Now we go g3 in a lot of these positions. Even in some lines when this bishop, dark square bishop, is on f2, we go g3 and we can even sacrifice the pawn on g3 in a lot of situations. That's not really necessary right now, but remember, we are trying to open up some lines over here, and sometimes you have to sacrifice some material. And the thing is that the way we're going to continue here, let's say white plays knight to c7, we are going to go knight to g4. So we're going even further in, we're sacrificing our knight, and our goal is to get our queen to this h4 square to checkmate the king on h2. Now, of course, in a lot of cases, let's say white takes the rook, we will go queen to h4, white will play h3. In a lot of these cases, we have plenty of sacrifices, such as bishop takes h3, for example, and this king is just simply stuck. King to f1, bishop takes g2. If this is taken, this is just checkmate in 2 moves. If it's not taken, if the king runs away over here, we just keep sacrificing this. We just keep sacrificing this, and now queen g4 will lead to checkmate within the next couple of moves, just like this. This is checkmate right here. So remember that knight to g4 is a potential sacrifice. Well, first of all, you have to attack with g3. This is the main way of attacking. Secondly, you have sacrifices such as knight to g4 to attack this pawn, right? Let's say knight c7, you have knight g4 hitting the pawn over here. So remember that your main way of attacking is g3. You have sacrifices with knight to g4. If they ever go h3, let's say they play h3 immediately, you have bishop takes h3 sacrifices as well. This bishop is one of the main attackers, and this bishop is something that you sacrifice in a lot of King's Indian positions on h3 in order to open up this king right here. So knight g4 is a potential sacrifice. Bishop takes h3 is a potential sacrifice. There are some ideas, not exactly here, but in some other positions. There's knight h7, knight g5 to sacrifice the knight on h3. This is a possibility as well. Here you have faster ways of attacking, so knight h7 is actually a bad move. It just doesn't make sense to play knight to h7, but you have this sacrifice, you have this. Your goal is to bring your queen in over to h4, sacrifice on h3, and absolutely demolish this king on h1. Next up, we have a positional idea that I want to show you, and it's when white plays this move, bishop to g5. Now, bishop to g5 might look a little bit weird because you can simply play this move h6 to kick this bishop out. The thing about this move h6 is that, weirdly enough, it is not a good move to play h6. And the reason why it's not a good move is because this pawn can be used as a target, because on h7 it's not a target, but after h6 it is a very clear target. And what's funny is that bare minimum, absolute bare minimum, what white is able to do with this pawn right here is that white can play this move queen to d2, and this just wins a tempo. So king h7 is a move that you don't necessarily have to play. You have some alternatives. Like, for example, you have knight to c5, but then there's going to be f3. And there are some alternative tactical ways that you can defend h6. But what white is trying to do is white is trying to get you to play king h7, which is just a very, very useless move for the black pieces. And bare minimum, white wins a tempo here because king h7 is a very useless tempo used by the black pieces. And at like maximum, this pawn on h6 can be used as a hook in some positions with moves like g4, let's say knight to c5, f3, and then this pawn right here is going to be very, very weak if h4, h5 actually lands. So this is very dangerous. This is something we're going to talk about very, very soon also. But remember that bishop g5 is trying to bait out h6, and then white will use this pawn as a target to attack and win at least a singular tempo. There are some variations in the King's Indian where you will be getting attacked on the king side with the black pieces. Now, for example, semi-overback is one of those variations where white puts the bishops on e2 and e3, and then white plays g4, knight to c5, attacking the pawn right here. It has to be defended with f3, and then white tries to go h4, h5. Now in this position, if you allow the pawn to get to h5, this is already very, very bad, because now queen to d2 will be played, bishop to h6, and white will get a huge attack. You can try something like a4, let's say, queen to d2, bishop to d7. You can try something like this, but white will queenside castle, and an attack is coming on your king, and you don't necessarily have counterplay on this side of the board. If you play a3, white will simply play b3. So your counterplay is very, very limited, and or non-existent even, I would say. And the thing is, once h4 lands, you can't even play h6. You might think that you can play h6 and then g5, but the problem is, okay, you're technically stopping the attack right here. If you get a setup like this, you're not going to be getting attacked anymore. But remember, our idea was to play f5. If we play g5, we are lessening our control over f5. We're not going to be able to play the f5 pawn break to activate our position anymore, while white still has his queenside ideas with b3, a3, b4, and then setting up c5 in a couple of moves. So this position would be strategically dead for the black pieces. So that's why in these types of positions, when white plays h4, you need to fight back with h5. You have to play this move h5. You cannot let the pawn get to h5, and then the play would continue something like g5, knight to d7, and in this position, it's still a game. Of course, white is slightly better in these positions, but you're still fighting back with the black pieces, and the play still continues on from here. You can start to fight back on the f file. Let's say b3 is played. You can even play f5 right away. En passant here will be played, and then the knight takes. And this is the position that you're going to get. You're going to be pressuring this pawn on f3. You're going to be pressuring this pawn on h4. And the game continues on from here. Whenever you see that your opponent has played h3 and he's potentially planning on playing g4, or he's just controlling the g4 square, what you can do in these types of positions is play this maneuver of knight to h5 to go to f4. And this is very, very useful because g4 is never going to be a possibility anymore. You would jump this knight over to f4. Of course, bishop for knight trade in this case benefits black because black opens up his dark square bishop while white trades off his dark square bishop, which is not beneficial for him. And these positions are extremely dangerous for white because if white makes one wrong move, white will be losing in this position. And it's very uncomfortable because if you play bishop to e3, and you might think that you can get a pawn here, but the problem is you can allow white to win this pawn on f4, and then you can just strike with f5 in a couple of moves because the king is still in the center, the queen is on f4, and the position is just simply opening up. So for example, e takes f5, g takes f5, and g5 has to be played by white to close down the f file at least. But remember, this king is still on this square on e1. It's still in the center of the board, so we can take advantage of this very, very nicely, and this is already a very nice position. So knight h5, knight f4 right here is a very, very nice maneuver that you can go for. White can continue with a move like g3, and this is the main line here, but now you can play f5, and after e takes f5, you can go g takes f5, and this is why knight h5 works so well, because your only idea is not to bring the knight to f4, you're also going for f5. This is why this works, and this maneuver is useful in not just this structure, but in other structures as well, because if you get the knight to f4 and white ever takes it, then you open up your bishop's diagonal. So this is a very nice maneuver. We were talking about the kingside attack by the white pieces a couple of ideas ago, and the thing is that the kingside attack is really reinforced by the knight being on g3. So what do I mean by that? Let's say we go e5 in this position. e5 is not great in this variation. In the same-ish, e5 is not so great because of this very reason. Let's say bishop to g5 is played. Both sides will simply develop here, but the problem is that this knight, when it goes to e2, it has a very clear path to g3. And remember that we were talking about how h5 is the way to fight back in these lines. Well, now the problem is that if you play h5 right now, it's just simply not as effective. Because earlier, if the pawn took on h5, you would be able to take back with the knight. There was no knight on g3. So this knight was just a very, very nice blockader. If I were to go back to this position right here, after h5, g takes h5, you take with the knight, and this is totally fine. White cannot remove this knight so easily. If you try something like f4, that is completely catastrophic. Just knight takes f4, or even pawn takes f4, opening up this bishop right here. But the thing is, if the knight is on g3, this no longer works, because knight can just simply take, g takes h5, and now after rook to g1, white gets a quick attack on the black king. In some variations, you can play this knight c6 move because d5 is not as effective in some of these variations. For example, in the same-ish, there is no knight on f3. So d5 doesn't work as well because you can jump the knight to e5, and if f4 is played, then there's knight to g4 attacking this bishop. And basically, the way you justify this knight c6 move is by gaining this tempo on the bishop on e3. So in a lot of these lines, white actually doesn't play d5 and plays queen to d2 instead, but now we can strike in the center with e5 and then jump the knight to d4. And this knight on d4 is extremely useful. If white wants to get rid of it, white has to play knight e2, and here you can either take or you can play c5. These are all different variations and different ideas that you can go for. But the thing is, a very common mistake in this position is to take this knight, because after e takes d4, queen d4, there is unfortunately a very nice tactical trick here. And unfortunately for white, very, very fortunately for black, there's knight takes e4, discover attack on the queen, and also we're taking a pawn, so knight takes, we would take the queen. And if queen takes is played, and now after rook e8, the queen is simply lost. So remember that white cannot simply take a pawn here and give up his dark square bishop. Most of white's pawns are on light squares, so the dark square bishop is the protector of the dark squares, and you do not want to give it up with the white pieces. But with black, if white trades it off, this is going to be very, very beneficial for you. Now I want to move on to a totally different variation and a totally different structure, and the next structure that we're going to be talking about is the exchange variation structure. So the first idea in this structure is going to be the fact that this pawn is not hanging in a lot of lines. So for example, you might have noticed, and some of you might have thought already, okay, in this position this pawn is hanging. No, because there are two attackers and there's only one defender. However, the problem is if you take this pawn with the white pieces, black will simply trade the queens, and black has this tactical shot, knight takes e4. Because now this knight is also under attack, and if you take the knight on e4, there's always going to be just a very simple bishop takes on e5. And if you try to get an intermezzo like knight takes g6, there's always going to be bishop takes c3 with a check when the king is in the center of the board. So after b takes c3, we have h takes g6, and in this case we didn't just win our pawn back, we won an entire piece. So this is a very strong line for the black pieces, but this is of course not what white will go for. White will most likely take on e4, you will take on e5, and in this case you've at least already equalized the game with the black pieces. But according to the computer, you're actually even slightly better, because even though it's equal material, your bishop on e5 is much stronger than his counterpart. The bishop on d1 is also not really impressing anybody, and the knight on e4 is just a target. You can attack it with f5 in a lot of lines, so this is not even a good knight in the center of the board. So white's pieces are all not very good. While you have a very strong bishop, you're going to put the rook on e8, and this is just a very nice position for the black pieces. Now I want to show you a common mistake that is played in this position after bishop to g5. This is the Averbach variation. And the thing is, earlier we talked about how h6 is not really a good move because it creates a target on this square, h6 itself, for the black pieces. But why do people play this move? The reason why people play this move is that they want to play the e5 system, but they can't play the e5 system right now because of a tactical reason that I'm about to show you. They play h6, so they get rid of this bishop, and then they play e5. But the thing is, if you play e5 right away, this fails tactically, because after d takes e5, d e5, after queen d8, rook d8, there's knight to d5. So now the pawn on c7 is under attack, the knight on f6 is also under attack, and as it turns out, you cannot defend both. If you play c6, you lose the knight. If you play knight d7, you lose the pawn with a tempo because the rook is also under attack. So the best thing you can do in this position is to actually take on d5 and give up the exchange with the black pieces, and you're going to be worse. After knight to f4, this is only +1, but every other position, for example, if you play knight d7, this is like +1.7, so this is much better for white. So the best thing to do is to give up the exchange. But the way you avoid this whole shenanigan with bishop to g5, you either play h6 to attack this bishop, and then you play e5, which, as we talked about, playing h6 is not necessarily the greatest thing to do in my opinion. But what I would recommend is that you actually play for c5 and you go into the Benoni systems. We will talk about this later in the video. But remember that e5 fails tactically whenever the bishop is on g5 due to the queen trade and then knight to d5. So remember this tactic. One thing that I want you to notice in this position is that this square on d4 is extremely weak. Now, our counterpart on d5 is not as weak because we can always play c6 in order to control the square on d5. But the problem is that white cannot do the same for d4 because he already played e4 and he already played c4 as well, which leaves this square very, very weak. So the best thing to do in this position is to go knight to c6, not knight to d7. Knight to d7 is a line, but it's a bit suboptimal, and we will talk about why momentarily. But after knight to c6, bishop to g5, you will go bishop to g4. Your goal is to trade bishop for the knight because you want to remove the defender of the d4 square. You will jump the knight to d4, knight to d5, let's say, and c6. If you get this exchange, for example, if you get to this position, you're always going to be strategically winning. This is a very, very normal good knight versus a bad bishop scenario because it's an outposted knight versus a suboptimal bishop. So this would be better for the black pieces. So this is a really, really good situation for the black side if you are able to occupy this d4 square. Now let's briefly talk about why knight to d7 is maybe not the greatest variation for the black pieces, and it is slightly inferior to knight c6. That is because in a lot of these positions, say you play c6, both sides will continue developing, but the problem is that the same queenside expansion ideas exist in this position as well for the white pieces. And even though you can go queen e7, attack this pawn, c5 will be played. And because you played a little bit passively here with knight d7, you didn't necessarily go for knight c6, knight d4. This is slightly inferior. This is slightly more passive for the black pieces. And now white has ideas such as, well, both sides are maneuvering first and foremost, but white has ideas such as bringing this rook to d6 in order to just get it to a very, very nice square, or even the knight. So like knight d2, knight c4, knight d6 maneuver exists for white as well. So this queenside expansion is really, really strong for white, even in this exchange structure. And you need to remember that in these types of positions, it's really, really difficult to win this with the black pieces. You're basically hoping that white makes a mistake here, because there's really not a good way to add pressure to your opponent's position unless you can maneuver this knight to e6 and get it to d4 somehow. But that's like more difficult now. You could have done that earlier if you went to c6 immediately, but you didn't go to c6, you went to d7. So now this allows queenside expansion for the white pieces. You also have to remember that in some of these positions, the knight on e6 is extremely versatile. And when I say some of these positions, I mean the exchange King's Indian, this variation in this structure specifically. In these lines, the knight on e6 is really good because it controls 4 really important squares. It hits the bishop on g5, controls f4, controls d4. It can potentially go to c5 to attack the pawn on d4. And also, an additional benefit to having a knight on e6 rather than c6 is that it doesn't block the c pawn. So now you can freely play c6 to further control d5. So this is an extremely versatile square for the knight on e6. In a lot of these positions, white retreats the bishop back to e3, and the way you're going to develop this bishop is with b6 and bishop to b7. And once again, if knight takes e5 is ever played, you always have knight takes e4, and this goes into a very sharp line. There might be knight takes g6, you go h takes g6, knight e4, but you're going to be able to take the pawn on b2 at the end of this sequence. So remember that the knight on e6 is extremely versatile. So now I want to move on to a different structure, and the structure that I want to talk about is when black takes the pawn on d4. Now this structure has its upsides and downsides. The downside is that you no longer have a central pawn, so you don't have a pawn on e5 anymore, which sort of reduces your control and influence over the center of the board. But the upside of making this capture is that whenever you take on d4, you basically open up your bishop. So if white were to play d5, the bishop would stay closed. But by making this capture, you're basically opening your bishop up just like this. So you would have to move the knight, of course. Once you move the knight, then you open up the bishop. So in a lot of these lines, you have to remember this idea of playing for the d5 pawn break. And let's say you play rook to e8, attacking this pawn, f3 to defend it. And in a lot of these lines, when white plays f3, remember that the bishop on e3 is a target. It is a very, very important target, and you have to take advantage of this very, very quickly. You have to play c6, and then bishop to f2 sort of has to be played. If you castle, there's d5 anyways, but bishop f2, there's d5 as well. So there's going to be d5 pretty much no matter what white plays, but this way, at least the bishop is not hanging. And this goes into a crazy theoretical line with ed5, cd5, and then the castles. And then in this position, knight c6 and c5 is played. And the reason why c5 is played is because this is sort of an isolated pawn. It can be a target in a lot of positions. So c5 makes sure that you cannot trade your d pawn for the c pawn. So this is a very specific line that I'm not going to go into too deeply because it is a very theoretical line. There are some ideas here, but the ideas themselves are very specific to this particular line. So I'm not going to be talking about this theoretical line in this video. If you want to check this line out and learn ideas, you can do so in the Masters database. You can look at Masters games from these positions. But the idea is to execute the d5 pawn break, because if you don't, then this pawn on d6 will be very, very weak, as we will talk about very, very soon. There is another idea that you should be aware of in these positions. Instead of the d5 pawn break, you can go for the f5 pawn break. And that typically happens when you move the knight with the tempo. So for example, bishop to f4 allows you to go knight h5 with the tempo, with the threat on the bishop. Bishop to e3, pawn to f5, taking advantage of the fact that this bishop is undefended. Queen to d2, f4, bishop back to f2, and you just sort of reinforce this diagonal right here. You're actually, the bishop on e5 holds everything here. It disallows either g3 or g4 by the white pieces. We talked about how g4 was really useful like way earlier in this video, and it's actually an idea even here, but it's not possible due to this bishop being very useful on g5. So the thing about these types of positions with f5, f4 is that your main idea with black is to go for a kingside attack with moves like queen to g5, h5, h4, move the knight away, bishop to h3, and so on. You have plans and ideas like this. The problem is that white's counterplay on the queen side is usually much faster, and you can only go for this attack if white doesn't know what he's doing and if white completely misplays the position. So for example, if a3 is played by the white pieces and you go queen g5, there's b4, you can try to go for h5, but the thing is, as I said, knight to a4, white is faster with his counterplay with c5 than you are with your play on the king side. So white is going to be able to open up the center much quicker. So you have to be defensive, and in reality, you just have to respond to white's ideas rather than actually create threats of your own. This is an extremely weird structure that's very, very difficult to play. I would say probably you should stay away from these types of positions if you're lower rated, because they're very, very strategically rich and they are extremely difficult to play. But the idea and the option is still there. You can go for knight h5 and you can go for the f5 pawn break. There is another thing you should be aware of in these types of positions, and that is that if you don't go for d5 and if you don't go for f5, you don't really have a plan with the black pieces. So for example, you can try to create some sort of queenside initiative with something like queen to b6, a5, and then a4, and this is actually sort of a tactical trick. If knight to d4 is played, there's knight takes e4 attacking the queen, and then there's queen takes d4, queen d4, and then bishop d4. You have something like this, and then the bishop is hanging at the end of this sequence. So you can try to go for some sort of a queenside initiative, but the problem is that if white is just a little bit careful, he attacks your queen here, you go back, white goes back to the center of the board. The problem is that you don't really have a plan, and some people say that there is some practical value in these types of positions, but if you want to know my opinion, I'm not a huge fan of these positions with the black pieces. Computer says that this position is only plus 0.6. I don't really know what to do here with black, because you can't really activate the position because you never played a pawn break. You never played f5, you never played d5, you never played b5, and b5 is like the hardest pawn break to get in these lines, and it's not even that good. But the thing is, you just simply cannot get any play if white is very, very careful. Not to mention, this pawn is a constant weakness. So what white will do is white will simply pile up pressure on the d and e files, move the knight away at some point, and attack this pawn on d6. And what are you going to do then? How are you going to defend this pawn? So that's why I don't really like these types of positions. I don't like this whole system with e takes d4. If you want to play this, I would highly, highly recommend you learn what to do. Like specifically, you learn these lines and you study them a lot. Because if you go into these lines and if you don't know what you're doing, you're basically left with a constant weakness and a constant headache to deal with. Next up, I want to talk about a different structure, and that is the Benoni structure with c5 and d5. Now, the thing about these positions is that you can even go into the main line Benoni from here. So, for example, if you play e6, let's say white castles, you capture on d5, there's c takes d5. This is the main line Benoni by transposition. So you could have started out with d4, c5, and you could have gotten this position exactly. So the thing is, you can go into Benoni structures with the black pieces in the King's Indian defense. But the thing is that I wouldn't necessarily recommend going into the mainline Benoni stuff. And also, I'm not going to be talking about the mainline Benoni in this video. That's a totally different opening, and this video is going to focus on the King's Indian defense and mostly the E5 systems. However, there's one thing that I want to mention, one very specific detail that I want you to know, and that is that you can attempt to get improved Benoni positions. So for example, what do I mean by that? Let's say white plays a different variation, let's say bishop to g5, because against knight f3, you're going into the mainline Benoni. This has known to be slightly better for the white pieces at the highest level, but it's still a good practical opening for the black side. I'm not just gonna hate on this opening, but one thing that's really important to know is that let's say white plays a different variation, let's say the Averbach variation. In these positions, going for c5 is actually even better because you're playing an improved Benoni, and the reason why this is an improved Benoni is because white, instead of playing knight f3, played bishop to g5. And this bishop g5 move is sort of an useless tempo for the white pieces because bishop typically wants to go to the f4 square. So let's say you play e6 in this position and then knight to f3 and then e takes d5 and let's say c takes d5. This position is an improved Benoni for black because bishop to g5 has been played, but this bishop doesn't want to be on g5. It wants to be on f4, pressuring the pawn on d6. So this is sort of a waste of a tempo, and you can go h6 here. And now with bishop to f4, there's b5, and there are some tactical ideas and some tactical issues as well, such as like bishop takes b5, knight e4, and then there are some like crazy tactics just like this. This is like a typical Benoni tactic. It's not something that you necessarily have to concern yourself with specifically for this video. But the thing is, what you can try to do is you can try to achieve improved Benoni positions if you know your Benoni systems quite well. And if you want to be a strong King's Indian defense player, you need to know which system works best against which move order. So for example, knight to f3. Against knight f3, c5 systems just go into the mainline Benoni, which has been known to be good for the white side. So that's why we play e5 systems to mitigate some of that advantage for the white side. But against bishop g5, we already talked about how e5 systems are very bad. Even h6 and then e5, even these systems aren't necessarily that great, but c5 systems against bishop g5 work very, very well, and they work surprisingly well. Even the Marazzi bind, even these structures, you have queen a5. You're trying to take advantage of this bishop being on this g5 square, and there is no knight d5 in these positions because the knight is simply pinned. If there was knight to d5, this would be problematic, but there is no knight to d5. Even here, knight to d5 runs into bishop takes d4, so it's not a big deal whatsoever. So what I'm trying to say in this part, and this might be the most important part of this entire video, and that is that you should know your move orders. You should learn which systems work against which variations. And once you master that, you're going to become a very, very strong King's Indian defense player. There is also a very specific gambit that you can play if you play this move pawn to c5. What you're doing is you're essentially gambitting this pawn. Now, a better thing to do for the white pieces would be to play something like either d5 or to play knight g to e2. These are both systems that are better than taking on c5. But the thing is, taking on c5 is an actual gambit for the black pieces. And after you take on c5, after you take back on c5, I should say, bishop takes c5, you have knight c6. Even if a queen trade happens, the problem is that you can go b6. Well, problem for white, not for you. You can go b6 and bishop a6, and you always have massive compensation for the sacrificed pawn in these positions, and they lead to really, really dangerous positions. And this position right here is better for the black pieces. You're down a pawn, but according to the computer, you're actually better in this position. So if you want to learn this system, you shouldn't really be afraid of c5. You can actually gambit this pawn right here on c5, and you can go into these types of positions where you can get a lot of compensation for your sacrificed pawn, and you get a lot of compensation with your activity. Okay, I skipped too much here, but after knight to d5, you can go e6, takes, and the thing is, white is simply struggling to develop. If white castles or something like that, you're playing rook to d2, you're getting on the second rank, and this is just much better for the black pieces. So white really needs to be careful in these systems. I'm not going to go into too much detail in these Benoni structures. However, what I'm going to tell you is what are the main plans of the position. I'm briefly going to go through the main pawn breaks. So the main pawn breaks for the black pieces are e6 in this position and a6 and b5. And in some positions, you even sacrifice a pawn with a6, b5, and you actually open up the A and B files, and you have a lot of play on those files. So let's say e6 is played. What that might look like is something like this. You're going to go a6. White should always try to go for a4 whenever you go a6. So this is a typical idea in Benoni positions. If black plays a6, white should play a4 in order to control b5. If white plays, let's say a move like bishop to d3, this allows b5, and this is already better for black because you're going to go c4, you're going to go knight d7, knight c5, and this is already very comfortable for the black pieces. You get a lot of space. But white will not allow you to do that. White will go a4, and you have some sort of tricks, like queen a5 is not really a trick because it's still a good move, and your idea is to enable b5 once again. So for example, knight g to e2, you can already, or knight d7 first, knight g3, you can prepare it after a couple of moves. You can still go b5 because you're taking advantage of the fact that this rook is undefended on the a1 square, and the pawn on a4 cannot take on b5 because the queen has moved. That's just one of the plans in the position, one of the ways you can try to execute b5. But remember that your main ideas and pawn breaks from this position are e6 and a6 and b5. You can start with e6 and then you can go for a6, b5, and if you're able to execute a6, b5 successfully, you're going to already equalize and probably be even better from that position. There's another clever little tactical trick that I want to show you, and it's actually very similar to something that we saw earlier. So for example, if you play e6 and then let's say queen to d2 by white, captures on d5, and then you can play h6, and it looks like this pawn is hanging, but it's actually not. If you take this pawn, there's knight takes e4, and this is already something that we saw earlier, this knight takes e4 move, but it's slightly different here because in this case, if knight takes e4, we have queen h4 check, and this h6 tactical trick works when they play f3. So this diagonal has to be open for this tactical trick to work because queen h4 has to come with a check. And here if g3 is played, queen takes h6, we can get a queen trade. We might even lose this pawn, but it doesn't matter because we're going to be ahead in development. Even if all the pieces get traded off, yes, you're down a pawn, but you're going to gain a lot of activity, and pretty much all of your pieces are developed. This bishop is going to come over here, and then it's going to pressure this diagonal. There are some lines where it might go to this square, for example, give a check to the king. You're going to win this pawn as well because white is going to struggle to defend it. Like you're attacking this pawn right here, and then you go rook to c5, rook to d8, bishop to f8, attacking this pawn, and now it just simply cannot be defended, and you're going to win this pawn. If d7, you go rook to c7, and there you go. You win your pawn back with at least an equal, but I would say a slightly better position for the black pieces because you got the bishop versus the knight, which is going to be slightly beneficial in the end game because there are pawns on both sides of the board, and in such end games, the bishop being a long-range piece is more useful than the knight. Idea number 27 is something that I briefly showed earlier, and it is that you can go into an improved Marazzi bind if you play c5, and as we said, d5 goes into Benoni positions, what's called a Benoni position, But knight f3 and c takes d4, knight d4 goes into something that resembles a Marazzi bind. Marazzi bind is when a c pawn is traded for a d pawn and white has the pawns on c4 and e4 clamping down on the d5 square. So this is the Marazzi bind right here, not to be confused with this position right here. This is not the Marazzi bind. Only with the c pawn, this would be the Marazzi bind. But the thing is, if bishop to g5 is played and then you go c5 and we get this sequence, the problem is that the bishop on g5 is a target. So you can go queen to a5, you can go knight to c6, and after knight to b3 you can even go queen b4. Well, this bishop is defended, so of course you cannot take it with the black queen because it's defended by the white queen. But you get a slightly improved Marazzi bind because you quickly get your queen to this b4 square. You can go bishop to e6, and if white castles, you're already slightly better after bishop to e6 because it's just not easy to defend this pawn on c4, and it's not easy to kick out this queen because a3 loses the knight on b3. So this is sort of an improved Marazzi bind, and it's very annoying for white to deal with, I might say. And the thing is, all of this happens because in these c5 systems, having the bishop on g5 seems to be a slight disadvantage for the white side. Now, you need to be sort of advanced in order to be able to utilize this information, but I'm still giving it to you, so, you know, do what you will with this information. But I'm just telling you, when the bishop is on g5, it tends to become a target quite a bit. Another interesting and kind of a rare way of playing these positions is to go knight to c6 and then a6 b5. So you're going for the b5 pawn break, but this is kind of rare and it only works in certain systems. For example, in the Fianchetto system, the bishop is already on g2, so it's on this diagonal right here. It's not on f1, it's not on e2, so it's not on this diagonal, so it cannot control the b5 pawn break. So in some of these positions, after knight to c3, let's say a6 is played, h3 by white, stopping bishop to g4, and then rook to b8, e4, and then b5. So this is something that you go for in some of these positions, and your goal here is to just simply get some counterplay on this side of the board. If you can get the pawn to b4, you're going to be able to kick the knight out. You might even win the pawn if white isn't careful. And if a3 is played, you go b4 anyways, because after a b4, knight b4, you're opening up the b file and you're creating a target on b2, and then you're going to be able to team up your rook and your bishop very, very soon by playing knight d7 and c5. I would assume, I actually didn't follow this line that far ahead. I would assume in some of these positions you can go knight d7 to set up c5 in order to open up this bishop, so the bishop and the rook actually team up on this pawn on b2. But the main idea that I really wanted to highlight was this a6 b5 approach, which is possible in variations where this bishop is not on this diagonal right here. It's actually on this diagonal, so white has less control over the b5 square. This idea also happens in some same-ish lines, so let me show you some of those lines right now. So for example, if we were to get a position like this, let's say knight to e2 is played, and against knight e2 it's still possible to go knight c6, because in these positions the bishop is blocked by the knight. So you can still go for this a6 b5 approach, rook b8, a6 b5 approach. And this is also another legitimate way to play this position. And as we talked about, d5 is not necessarily that great in these positions because there are lots of things that are loose and hanging. So d5 not exactly a very good move in this variation by white. But for black, let's say queen to d2 is played here. With the white pieces, you can go rook to b8, and let's say h4, you can go b5. Now, I'm not playing all the best moves right now for the black pieces, so I'm not showing you the best line necessarily, but I'm just trying to highlight the idea of this a6 b5 approach. The goal is to either open up the b file Or if you get a pawn on b5 and if you're not able to open up the b file, you can always go b4 in order to get rid of this knight and make white's life just a little bit more uncomfortable. And then from here you can go bishop to a6, you can go knight a5, knight c4 in some of these positions, and it just leads to very, very dangerous counterplay by the black pieces. Now again, computer finds a way to punish this because computer finds a way to punish everything. But this is a legitimate way of playing in the fianchetto variation, for example, and it is something that you should keep in mind, and it is an option that exists for black. And the last two ideas are technically not going to be in the King's Indian defense because it is actually going to be in the London system, but we're going to talk about how you can deal with the London system if you're playing the King's Indian setup. So again, this is technically not the King's Indian defense, but I will still teach you what to do here. I will give you two additional ideas just to get to the number 30, and I don't want to leave it at 28. Number 30 just is, it's a round number, it's a very nice number. So idea number 29 is going to be the fact that sometimes e5, e4 comes with a fork, it comes with a tempo, and in a lot of these lines, putting the bishop on d3 is actually wrong for white. It's good for black because in a lot of these lines, your goal is to play e5, right? We already talked about this, that you want to play e5 in these positions, but if white isn't careful, e5 comes with a tempo on the bishop. Let's say de4 is played, let's say bishop moves back, but now e4 also comes with a tempo, and in these positions you successfully win a piece. So this is a tactic that works from time to time at lower levels, and that's why people in these positions put the bishop on e2 and not on d3. And idea number 30 is going to be to go after this London bishop. So for example, let's say knight to f3 is played, castles, bishop e2 and d6. A very common mistake in this position with white is to play castles, which it looks very, very natural. But the problem for white is that you have knight h5. And now you can trade your knight for the bishop right here. If the bishop goes back, of course you can take. If c3 or something like this is played, you can still take. And if bishop to g5 is played, trying to avoid a trade, well, you have h6, g5 anyways, and then you can even go f5. You can take on the next move here. Let's say c3 is played. You don't even have to, but you can always take to get the bishop pair, and you can get a position like this, which kind of resembles the Leningrad Dutch, but an improved version of the Leningrad Dutch because you traded off the knight for the bishop. So this is a very nice position that you can go for, and it is a very nice way of playing as well. Most people in this position at higher levels will play h3, and this is the main move in this position, is to play h3. And now if knight h5, you just go back with the white pieces, you go back to h2. So this is the way white should continue, but it's a very common trick that I think that you should be aware of. So that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm very, very tired right now because I've been making this video for about, for about like what, 6 hours now, maybe probably even more. So I hope you hit the like button. I hope you share this video, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Peace.